Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. I always say we have a special guest, but I really mean today we have a very special guest. We have Dr. Carl Hendrick on. And if you're not familiar with his work, well, after today's talk, I know you're going to sign up for his Substack, and it's called The Learning Dispatch. And the article that we're going to be talking about today is Defending the Science of Learning. But let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Carl Hendrick. He is one of the leading voices in the science of learning and explicit instruction. He is the co-author of 2 best-selling and prize-winning books, How Learning Happens and What Does This Look Like in the Classroom. He has experience in both private and public schools, and he brings a wealth of real-world knowledge backed by rigorous research. He's a professor, and we're just delighted to have him. I'm a huge fan, and after Judy read this article, she right away signed up for his Substack. So I encourage you to do so. He's just a wonderful writer and a brilliant mind. So let's get started. So the article, as I said, is called Defending the Science of Learning. And one of the quotes in here, Carl, very simple, was, "You cannot connect the dots if you don't have dots." And to me, that's the perfect way to get us started. What does that mean for those people who are unfamiliar with this topic or have a little bit of knowledge, so that you can connect the dots for them?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me on. It's a real honor for me to be on the Literacy View. This is really about how the brain learns and the notion that we understand new knowledge through what we already know. We often hear, and all of us will be familiar with the term, "Oh, we don't need to teach facts or knowledge, we need to teach skills." 21st century skills, thinking skills, stuff like that. But what are you going to think with? And the idea really comes from, to my mind, one of the great voices in the science of learning is Frederick Bartlett. And in the 1930s, he wrote a book called Remembering. And the book it was one of the big shifts away from behaviorism and the idea that learning is something that's really about the external, that really this idea that it doesn't matter what's going on inside your head, it's just the inputs and outputs, and you can condition people to learn things. Bartlett did a series of fascinating experiments. One of them was he asked his students he told them a story which was about Native American culture, and then he got them to retell the story and noticed how they remembered it. And what he noticed was that every time they would retell the story, it was reconstructed. So it wasn't like a file drawer or like a tape recorder. It was like they were remembering it through what they knew. So they were referring to things that were outside of their culture, but referring to them as things within their culture. So he really was one of the first to put forward this idea that what we have in our long-term memory, to a large extent, determines how we see the world. And so then, of course, you have in the 1950s and 60s, you have this big focus on working memory, long-term memory, and the interaction between the two. But for some reason in education, over the last maybe 50 years, a view has taken hold, which is that knowing stuff is less important than skills. And having knowledge in your long-term memory is less important. And if that's the case, then facts are unimportant. Knowing stuff is unimportant. And so the argument I'm making there is against one that's a very kind of pervasive one in education. And it is the idea that you can discover things by learning them for yourself, or you can learn things by discovering them for yourself. And I think this view is very, very misguided, and it really flies in the face of what we know about how learning happens. So that analogy really is this idea that having stuff in your long-term memory is a form of empowerment. It makes you more powerful in the world to make sense of what you're seeing, to understand what you're seeing, and from a cognitive psychology perspective, it frees up your working memory that you can concentrate on what you do. So the irony is that you can actually be more critical or think more critically if you have stuff in your long-term memory. So that's where that idea comes from. I suspect that quote comes from E.D. Hirsch, but I don't know. But I think it might do. Most great or a lot of great things about knowledge come from him. So I definitely want to attribute that to him. I think you're muted, Faith.
As usual, I forgot. Always do that. Yeah, I'm a big fan of E.D. Hirsch. First book I read of his was The Knowledge Deficit, little book, and it really opened my eyes. So my co-host, Judy Boxner, she's a coach in the New York City schools. And she and I always talk about how baffling it is that people could poke holes in some of the things you're talking about. To me, it's common sense. Judy, what are some of your thoughts or questions for Carl?
So I woke up this morning, and the first thing that I did before I went to Equinox to work out at the gym, and I'm drinking a smoothie, guys, today instead of a Diet Coke. This is a miracle. Let's see how many times during the school year I have a smoothie instead of a Diet Coke. And it's the green smoothie, by the way. But I texted Faith because very often she'll send me really long articles and research studies to read, and my head is like spinning. I'm like, do you forget I'm a practitioner in the field, and this might be slightly overwhelming, and this is a lot. But this one, oh my God, Carl's article was my favorite. And I'm saying it on the air. It hit home. It was a pleasure to read. It made sense. It solidified a lot of the things that I was thinking about myself, and it made me feel heard. And it also gave me so much to think about. And there were so many analogies that he gave in the article that really hit home. So I'm a big fan, as everybody knows, of explicit instruction and structured literacy. Especially in the last 8 or 9 years of my career, this has been my greatest passion, especially moving away from my balanced literacy days, which had pockets of explicit instruction because I knew that kids needed to be shown how to do things. But this article really hit home about how important knowledge is, but also showing kids how to do something. And I love, Carl, the examples, and I hope you could talk about that. You gave examples of doctors. You gave examples of sports. You also mentioned a word that we've taken a lot of heat for, and I don't really understand why, strategies. When I'm shown how to do something, whether it be how to solve a math problem, very often I'm not a great math student. I needed strategies as a kid to understand how to tackle something. So, Carl, can you talk to me a little bit about how this explicit piece relates to like doctors, sports, education, and also I want to hear your views on strategies.
I love that question.
Yeah, great question. So one of the big differences between education and, say, medicine or even engineering or other fields or law is there's a kind of an agreed upon codified body of knowledge that even if it's contested, people are trained in it, they will defer to it. There's a basic level of professional responsibility that's really expected of practitioners in different fields. And so in education, we have this kind of buffet style approach where different people just go, well, I'm just going to try this today. I mean, we've all been teachers and we've all worked in schools and in a culture of, oh, I'm going to try this and I'm going to try that, and all different teachers doing different things. And that's, I think, a difficult one to get your head around because it's so endemic in our profession that teachers will just do whatever they want to do because they're the experts. They know their kids so well, and that's just what works. But I think that as you're finding out, there are strategies that on average will produce a better effect than others. And when we talk about the science of learning, and I said in that article, I'm not the greatest fan of that phrase because it really encompasses 3 or 4 fields. There's no, there is an idea that it's not so much the science of learning, but it's the sciences of learning. And I am sympathetic to that view. But if you want to learn, and if you want to teach a 5-year-old to read, a 6-year-old to read, there's a strategy that is better than another strategy. I mean, there's just not an argument about that. And we can say all we want, well, I prefer this or I prefer that. But my argument is that you have an ethical responsibility to children, particularly those children who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, not to be doing things that, well, this is what I like to do, or, this is what works for me. It's not about what works for you. It's about what works for the child. And we have hard fought knowledge. We have really strong knowledge about this. And also, we know that we are more similar than different in how we learn. And this idea that we need these radically different approaches for kids. I have very young twins. One of our twins is autistic. And so I've been on this journey of finding out, well, what's going to work for her? What's going to work for her in a mainstream setting? And what I've sort of realized from my own research and reading research in adjacent fields is that I don't want someone to prejudge what she's capable of before she has had a go. I don't want someone to look at a form and go, well, she's not going to be able to do this because she's X, Y, or Z. If anything, she needs even more instruction. She needs more clarity. She needs more clear guidance. She will not thrive in a chaotic environment where it's, if she's left to discover stuff for herself, that's fine if she's playing Lego. But she's not going to learn to decode the alphabet in that way. And to do so is cruel. It's not that anyone is doing that, but that's, I think, the biggest change for me. And, I think we will probably get to a stage as a profession. And you can already see it happening now, particularly in the US with around the area of reading. And that's where I think, I've always said that, you guys are in a very real sense, probably at the vanguard. Like if you talk about the science of learning, it's always people who understand the most about reading, who are the most knowledgeable. In other words, they're the ones closest to the evidence. In other words, if you're teaching 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds how to read, the feedback loops are really short. You get to see the impact very, very quickly. If you're teaching 16, 17-year-olds, those feedback loops are very, very long. You mightn't find out for a long time whether those students have learned anything. But my God, if you're teaching a 4 and 5-year-old, the effects are so quick and so fast. And I have another daughter who's 7. When she was being taught how to read, I was just blown away by her teachers, by her early years, like just even before she was in primary school, how she was prepared, the phonics instruction, the systematic, explicit nature of it, the fact that she learned, to understand the world, that she could. I've never seen anyone learn so much in such a short space of time. And I've been working in education for 15 years, teaching older kids and teaching university students. And I thought, my God, there's nothing I've ever done or taught anyone that is as powerful as what her teacher has taught her in terms of learning to read. So I think that there's a professional element to it, and we should require that of teachers and expect that teachers will be interested in the science of it. Not that it's a dogma, not that this is the only way to do it, but all of this is about probabilities. It's not about you have to do it this way. It's about empowering teachers to say, if you do X, it's probable that this is going to happen. And if you do this, then it's probable that's going to happen. So for me, it's about enabling teachers to make better decisions in their own classrooms.
I have to just give you a big cheers before we go on. So you're getting the first cheers button.
Oh, what a joy.
That was said so beautifully. And, as I'm listening to you, it reminded me of something that you put in this article. Like, this article to me is gold, and I have it in front of me. And you talked about perpetuating educational inequity. And I don't think people do this on purpose, like you said. A lot of this is attached to their own beliefs, and they're feeling like they know best, or it's what they like, as you said, aesthetically pleasing. Whatever the case is, I don't think they do it on purpose. But then there's the other side of this that you mentioned in your article too, which I love, is the idea of still being able to adapt something that follows the science. Now, Judy and I talk about this a lot, because just because you have a structure doesn't mean you're a robot. You're allowed, and it's encouraged, to adapt and adjust and to be responsive to the student. Could you talk a little bit about what responsive teaching is to you, and what you would advise to other teachers who stick to the script religiously and aren't really paying attention to the students because they feel stifled? I think that's why it gets a bad name, Carl. So if you could talk a little bit about that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. I think two of the phrases you see a lot in teaching now is this, as you said, adaptive teaching and responsive teaching. This is one of the key tenets of Dylan Williams' work on assessment for learning. And this idea that when we assess students or test them, we're not so much giving them a summation of what they know or what they can do, but the data is more useful for the teacher in informing what they're going to do next. Dylan has a wonderful phrase for this, which is that firstly, feedback should be more work for the recipient than the donor. It should be more work from the person getting it than giving it. And secondly, it should be about improving the student and not the work. And very often when we mark a piece of work, particularly at secondary level, we kind of tend to mark, this is what's wrong with it. And this is how, you need to do this to get this here. So the student is just thinking about a piece of work, but improving the actual student is a separate thing. And so let's take a direct instruction approach. And let's think about we obviously have capital D, capital I, or lowercase d, lowercase I. But let's say a classroom where there's a focus on the teacher as a fully guided instruction. In those classrooms, the teacher, and a lot of people, when they hear this, they're surprised. The explicit direct instruction model of Hollingsworth and Ybarra, they advocate that the teacher should talk for no less than 2 minutes without checking in with the students. In other words, some form of checking for understanding. And that could be mini whiteboard, hands up, a finger vote, whatever that is. If a teacher's doing that, let's say you have an hour lesson. If a teacher's doing that every 2 minutes, think of the vectors of knowledge, of the points at which the teacher can respond to those students. In other words, you're finding out in real time, ideally, what these students know or what they don't know. And the key thing is then you're meeting their needs. You're adapting to what they know. So the best teachers, for example, they will have methods of pausing their instruction and saying, okay, I want to know, do they really understand this? Are they getting this? And it could be, as I say, mini whiteboards, some sort of voting. As a general rule, if they're getting 80% plus success rate, they can go, okay, that's good. Those students who need that extra support, I'll provide that for them. But I'm good to go. I'm good to build on the knowledge that I'm building on. The teacher who kind of is able to somehow get some kind of barometer where it's maybe 60% or lower, they can go, you know what, I can see you're not getting this, guys. I'm going to try it this way. And that's what the superpower of teachers is, that they have what Schulman calls pedagogical content knowledge. In other words, they don't just know the content one way, they know it in several ways. And that's where teachers are really experts. They can explain things to 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds in a way that makes it come alive for them. So this idea of responsive teaching really is about what does the teacher do in response to student understanding or lack of understanding. And to my mind, the most or the best, most effective format of that is in the direct instruction model. In the minimally guided model, in discovery approaches or inquiry approaches, you might have students working for half an hour, 45 minutes. Well, if you found out at that stage that they didn't understand it, it's usually going to be too late. If you're finding out a week later from a student's piece of work that they didn't really understand what you taught them, then it's too late. So those fully guided models are very much about closing that gap between feedback and understanding. In other words, can we get it as close as possible? There's a brilliant analogy from Robin Hogarth. He describes wicked learning environments and kind learning environments. A kind learning environment is a tennis court. You make a mistake, the ball flies off. Well, I'm not going to do that again. A chessboard, you make a mistake, oh, I get punished for it. In a classroom, it's a wicked learning environment because you don't know if you've made a mistake as a teacher. Very often, the feedback loops are so long, it mightn't be 2 weeks, it might even be years later before before it comes to light that the student didn't understand what was being taught. And that distinction between performance and learning is so key. You can see students, it almost, and again, Judy, you talked about strategies. One of the great strategies in explicit instruction is checking for understanding, and not saying to a class, as I did for so long, okay, here's an explanation. Okay, does everyone understand that? Yeah. Okay, everyone happy with that? And all the kids, yeah. That's a very poor way of checking for understanding. So I think that the more adaptive and responsive we are as instructional designers and teachers, the more we're going to be able to meet the needs of our students, particularly those who are most vulnerable, who are good at hiding the fact that they don't understand things, or good at masking that they're just not getting what's happening. We have this secret of unlocking that student misconception. And also you're normalizing being wrong or not understanding. It's okay. That's fine. We'll just do it again. We'll explain it this way, or so on and so forth. So that to me is a very fluid, dynamic, exciting, engaging classroom. When you look at those classrooms, there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of learning going on. And I think we can learn a lot from those classrooms.
You leave me speechless, honestly. Just everything. No, seriously, you just have a way of saying things that you really cut through the BS. This whole article, I know you didn't say BS once in it, but you were calling out the BS, Carl. You really were.
Yeah, there was a lot of BS.
A lot of BS, and we're going to address that now. Judy, any questions or thoughts?
Yeah, you knew I had some. So I just want to touch upon something. I think you said something really important about checks for understandings.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of practitioners in the field, they're being told everything has to be planned in advance, who you're targeting, who you're seeing in your small group during a lesson. But I think as practitioners, we have to also be prepared to see, based on our check for understanding, who really is struggling and who do I possibly need to pull into a small group, maybe during independent practice. Because I think it goes back to what you said, Carl. You don't want people assuming things about your daughter all the time. And we shouldn't always place an assumption about what a student is going to find hard or easy. Yes, we know our students. Yes, we know our data. But not every lesson is exactly the same. And we can't just go in assuming, nah, this kid is a tier 3. he's not going to get it or she's not going to get it. So you know what? They're going to be my small group. So I think that's a really important thing. Would you agree, Carl?
Absolutely, 100%.
Judy, before you even say one more word, you're getting a big cheers, my friend. That was big time cheers, because I have to tell you, that always bothered me, that we have to spell out in writing a lesson plan. And then if someone observes, they're expecting to see exactly what's on the plan. But a good teacher needs to get off the plan in order to do the work that you're talking about, Carl. So, Judy, that was excellent.
Right. And that ties into being responsive, and that ties into authentic feedback, and that ties into that even though you have a script, you're being responsive. I'm not robotic. Do I look robotic? Do I act robotic? I am just as animated with something that's structured as and explicit, and I'm still the fun Judy, and I'm still swinging my magic wands all over the place in the classroom. Yes, I am. The boys and girls are waiting. They know. They know. Carl, I want to mention something. So in the article, you mentioned teacher autonomy confusing license with liberty. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? I found that to be very interesting.
Yeah. So again, I think there's a little bit of a paradox here. And again, this is sometimes difficult to get our heads around, in the sense that, you know, what you just said is so spot on, and that's also a question of professionalism, where, let's say in any situation in a classroom, there's 10 options you can choose. Well, 5 of those are going to be good options and 5 are probably not going to be good. It's the knowing which is going to be good, which is going to work. And so I think we often want teachers to have autonomy, to have license. But when you're faced with like I say, I've got 3 young kids. If a child is in front of you and they're upset, you don't need cognitive load theory. You need to be a human being. You need to respond to that child, and you need to adapt to their needs. Cognitive load theory is just one it's one arrow that you can use, and that's all it is. And it's certainly not a sort of a prescriptive, you have to do this. And one thing I'm really interested in is this idea of lethal mutations in education research, where you get very good research, and then by the time it gets into the classroom, it's like this mutation of its original form. And that's what's so great about the direct instruction models is, like you say, Judy, they give you clear strategies that's based on evidence. They're not saying, here's a kind of broad, sociological, philosophical idea, and you kind of, go and figure out what you want to do. So the paradox, I think, is that in a classroom where a teacher has a lot of different approaches and a lot of different methods that are really grounded in evidence, that they have a lot of different ways of making decisions, but that the decisions are going to lead to long-term gains. And lots of times they're things that we don't think. So for example, short-term performance is often a very bad indicator of long-term learning. But you don't know that until you read some research about it. And that's why teachers are constantly, as I was, saying to kids, how do you not remember this? I just taught it to you last week. I just explained this to you last week, and you all said you understood it. Well, taking a more evidence-informed approach would say, well, okay, I want these students to remember this stuff longer than 5 minutes. So what are the levers I can pull? What are the decisions I can make to help those students to have this in their memory? And then we're thinking about, is the curriculum sequenced, or is it just a teacher going, well, I'm just going to do this today because I think it's, what I want to do. And ironically, the paradox is that if you have a really well-structured curriculum, it allows you to be even more free, in the same way that, a great musician if you have great songs or great actor, I saw a wonderful interview with Benicio del Toro the other day, and they were talking about acting. What makes a good actor? And he said, know the script. Read the script 10, 15, 20 times. And if you have the script, then you can actually be more free to kind of just express yourself. And so to me, that's one of the things where, with teachers, if the teacher really knows what they're teaching, and if they have a range of strategies, they're free in the moment to just focus on the kids. And that's really what it's all about.
100%. Oh my goodness. Lethal mutations. I wrote that down. I love that. Love that. Some people don't know what cognitive load theory is. I probably should have stopped you at that moment, but I just wanted to hear what else you had to say. Could you just quickly clarify that? And also what my next thought was going to be on calling out the BS that you talk about here. The science of learning is not a political conspiracy. I want to go there, Carl.
Sure.
I mean, not too many people even touch that, but I do think it's important. So first, cognitive load theory, just give a little, definition, and then let's go into the BS with the political conspiracy stuff.
Can I just chime into one thing? And one thing that I had written down, the U.S. has a lot of mandated lists, and the programs that were being given don't necessarily follow all these explicit pieces and the best strategies, and don't have years of research. So I know that might be a little off topic, but
it's really
into mix. We're struggling.
Sure. So cognitive load theory is a model of both learning and instructional design. It makes predictions about how we learn. It comes from John Sweller, who came up with it in the 1980s. He did a series of experiments where he noticed that broadly there was two groups of students. One group of students who were trying to solve a problem, and they were doing what he calls means ends analysis. In other words, they were just trying different kind of random strategies until they hit upon the one that worked, and then they'd solve the problem. The other group understood the deeper underlying structure, and those students were able to do it much more efficiently and much more effectively. And so his idea, and the idea of cognitive load theory, is that because we have limits in our working memory, Miller's work in the 50s said that it's 7 plus or minus 2. We now think that's probably nearer 4. In other words, if you give somebody 4 novel units, so we say, of information, that's about as much as they can hold before they start going, what was the first one again? Because that's true, and because the fact that if you have a lot of stored knowledge, schemas of knowledge in your long-term memory, that frees up your working memory. Well, then that means, and this is where the theory comes in, that certain things that we do in a classroom are going to affect that more than others. And one of them is, if you're a novice, you need clear guidance from an expert. And that idea is, one that really ran counter to, particularly in the 1980s, how teaching and learning should happen. A part of cognitive load theory is, sometimes it's a little bit controversial, but he borrowed an element from David Geary and his work on evolutionary psychology, and the idea of, you have biologically primary knowledge, in other words, learning to walk, learning to talk, learning to read faces. Those things are hardwired. We're just naturally learned to do them. Biologically secondary knowledge is stuff we are not naturally disposed to do. Reading, writing. They're things that we have not evolved to do. And so, to learn that secondary knowledge, you need clear instruction from a novice. All kids will learn to walk on their own. We've been doing it for, we're evolved to do it. We're not evolved to read letters and read language. So you need that explicit instruction from an expert. And so cognitive load theory makes all kinds of predictions about, if that's true, then what we should do is we should have clear guidance at the beginning for novices from an expert. In other words, explain things, check for understanding, and then allow the student to move towards more independent practice. That stands in opposition with more discovery approaches, where we should allow the child to discover things for themselves initially. So there's a tension there between those two things. And cognitive load theory has been challenged a lot, particularly by a group of people, which leads me on to the next point. My belief is we should keep politics out of education. I think we just need to, it's really about, how learning happens isn't a political thing. It's nothing to do with politics. We shouldn't be bringing that into the classroom. If we're just thinking about curriculum design, if we're just thinking about instruction and assessment, and I do understand that there are broader discussions about curriculum, what should be on the curriculum, so on and so forth, and we should be sensitive to those, and they're important discussions. But in terms of how we learn, that is not a political question. In the same way that, how we digest, or how do we treat cancer, or they're not political questions, and we should keep the politics out of it. What happens, or unfortunately, in education, you have many people who are, shall we say, political activists first and educationalists second. And that to me is quite unhelpful, and the paradox there is that a lot of the people who are talking about equity and inclusion, all these things, are perpetuating the very, very same methods that are leading to inequity and leading to exclusion. So all those people talking about, how phonics is terrible, and systematic synthetic phonics, and how we should be doing 3Qing and balanced literacy, they were, and again, you have to ascribe good intentions to people. They weren't doing it on purpose, as you said, Faith, but they were leading to inequity. They were leading to children not being able to read, not being able to understand their world. And that to me is where, when we talk about explicit instruction of science of learning, it is a question of equity. It is a question of, trying to create the fairest outcomes for students. And so what happens is, you often see, it's usually education academics. If I see the word neoliberal in a research article, I get that straight away. I just go, okay, something's off here. Something's not, like, what's that got to do with anything? And it's usually, okay, science of learning, explicit instruction, these are neoliberal forms of oppression. And I think to myself, my God, that can only come from, that view can only come if you're coming at it from a kind of a broadly sociological, philosophical, anthropological kind of view. And it's not, those things are not important, but if we need effective methods of instruction, of understanding, of learning. And I think that to just, call someone right wing because you don't like what they're saying about teaching or learning. And by the way, it's usually wrong anyway. Most of the people I know who are advocates of the science of learning, not that it matters, but they're certainly, I wouldn't describe them as right wing. But that's seems to be, unfortunately, a common trope in education of, we don't like the fact that you're talking about cognitive load theory or working memory or long-term memory or knowledge. So you must be, a kind of right-wing fascist. And I think that's very unhelpful.
I have to tell you, I was attacked multiple times with those types of arguments. I was called reductionist and all sorts of titles, because this is what I feel helps children. And that should always be the bottom line. Now, Judy's question before about the programs out there that include parts of it that do not have this explicit instruction. And so it's like everything.
And they, some of these things that are on mandated lists include things that are not truly evidence-based because they haven't been or research-based, because there's not enough research on them. Some of them are actually quite new and they don't have a lot of studies. So on our show, I think Faith would agree, we're big believers in knowing your pedagogy, knowing your craft, knowing what it means to teach a kid based on explicit instruction. But now we have these mandated lists, and some of us are stuck with things that we may not be able to change. And, you know, we hear on different podcasts and so forth that this really had great results, and yet these things aren't on the list. So what should we practitioners do in the field if we're given something that may not produce or show evidence of producing the best outcomes for children?
Yeah, it's really, really difficult. I mean, in the UK, so I'm Irish. I've been living in London for 25 years. We various approaches came into focus about 10 years ago, and they were, broadly speaking, aligned with cognitive science. So I think looking back, and it kind of happened at two levels. So one level obviously was at a governmental level, but we shouldn't underestimate that grassroots power. And your podcast, I think, is one of those things that's extremely powerful, because it gives a real voice to teachers. It's spoken in a language that teachers understand. I think the field of education research, you know, to go back to my point about this, you know, neoliberal hogwash, all of that stuff is not, most teachers just are not interested in that. They just don't understand it. They can't even read it. It's not anything it doesn't speak to their kind of experience. So things like your podcast, things like you have a movement called Research Ed, which is a really powerful movement. It came out of the UK. There's lots of chapters in the US as well. They're teachers coming together with academics to talk about research and talk about the science of learning. Even things like the Soul the Story podcast. You know, these are things that are really having an impact on the ground. And it's difficult in the US, I think, because you have all these different states all kind of doing their own thing and all kind of doing, you know, very different things. But at some point, somebody's got to look at some of those successful, for example, those reading programs and think, well, wow, you know, what's happening in Mississippi? What's happening that's so powerful? What are the methods that we can use? How can we use them? But I guess it really comes down to the empowerment of teachers. I was doing things in my first 5 years of teaching that I had no way of knowing whether they're effective or not, because no one told me. I'd never read anything to do with the science of learning. It wasn't taught it in my teacher training year. So trying to empower teachers with, here's the limitations of long-term memory. This is how kids learn to read. All of these things they allow teachers to ask their own questions and maybe push back against some of this stuff. So I think that this, the work that you guys are doing really is it's advocacy, and it's so important because it's, I think I've learned that teachers are really thirsty to know more and improve, and often professional development is why so many people listen to your podcast, because teachers are every year they sit through PD and professional development and go, well, that's like pretty terrible. So they're really thirsty for that knowledge and to hear stuff and know stuff. So it's a really, really tricky one. But I think it starts with, can we get a shared understanding of how learning happens and how instruction works? And if we could do that, then yes, there's going to be differences, but at least we're starting from this place of, okay, we accept that these are the limitations of X or Y, and maybe then we could have a richer conversation.
So I'm going to piggyback on what Judy was talking about with programs. So in this country, there is a big push for knowledge building, and rightfully so. I mean, we want kids to have knowledge, but I think people mix up getting a program in and building knowledge. Two very different things.
Right.
Carl. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that? Because social studies for years was not really given a lot of attention. There's a big joke that kids don't even know where places are. We don't do enough geography, especially Americans. They lack that understanding, maybe because we're on our own little bubble. We're in Europe, you have countries all side by side. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the geography or it's just Americans. But I think people think that if they get a boxed program, that's their knowledge building. Yet it can miss so many different aspects of the world, and they could stay on something for weeks and weeks that might build their knowledge in a narrow scope, but wouldn't have this broader picture. Could you maybe talk about that a bit? I know that programs are not as, at least knowledge building curricula is not as big there, I don't think, as here. But if you could speak to that, that would be great.
Yeah. When we talk about knowledge, it's an extremely difficult term because it's not a neutral one. So in the last maybe 20 years, conversations about curriculum become very heated because, particularly when we in the humanities, for example, when people discuss now what goes on an English curriculum, for example, there's a broader range of conversations to be had that weren't had 20, 30 years ago, where you would say, well, for example, in science, you have significant figures like Darwin, Newton, Einstein, whereas in the humanities, the conversation is, well, how many of those people are women? Are they people of color? And those are all worthy conversations, but they mean that they're very, as you say, difficult conversations to have, and they're good conversations to have. But the idea with the knowledge focus is that it's really down to a focus on cognitive science. In other words, if we look at what makes someone competent in a domain, they have knowledge that is structured in a particular kind of way. It's usually cumulative in nature. It's connected in some way. It's not these, I think which you were alluding to there, these kind of disconnected facts. It's very much structured and it's built upon itself, and it leads to other things. That's why, so many of the programs with the early reading programs are so extraordinarily precise, well constructed. They're so clever in the sense that, well, you need to know this before you know this, and this leads to this, and so on and so forth. Whereas if you look at programs that are at high school level, you get this focus on very loose, nebulous skills. What's the difference between a top grade and a bottom grade? Well, sophisticated, use of X, Y, or Z. And that's a very loose kind of definition of knowledge. So I think when we talk about knowledge, there's a sense in which if you reverse engineer what's someone who's competent in a domain, you go back to the start and think, well, they need all of these bits to connect and link with each other. And then what you're doing is you're saying, well, what's the instructional devices that make those things come alive? Or what are the strategies that you can use? And they're going to be things like retrieval, spaced learning. They're going to be things like what Bjork calls desirable difficulties, things that may feel a little bit uncomfortable in the short term, but lead to longer term gains. I think what many teachers do, and I don't know if this speaks to your question about the programs, but a lot of teachers are simply thinking about covering content rather than enabling students to really know something deeply. So they're looking at it and going, well, I've just covered unit 3, it's done, I can move on, without thinking about, how can we get them to know that thing in 6 to 9 months? Well, the science of learning has great answers for those questions, because We know that spaced learning and retrieval and so on and so forth and generative learning allows students to do that. And so that I think is where it's not so much thinking about knowledge as being encountered, but how you encounter it. Where does a 12-year-old, if they learn a new word or a concept, how many times should they encounter it? In what context should they encounter it? It's not just going to be, well, I've explained it, you can move on because I've covered it. And if you've forgotten it, then that's your problem. We should be thinking about how can we enable that knowledge to be cumulative and build. For example, morphology. That's such an important idea that I think so many other subjects could learn from. That if you learn this knowledge in this way, it allows you then to understand the world in a different way. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's what I got.
Yes. I really appreciate that thoughtful response, honestly. And I've been thinking about this a lot. And I think that there's a misunderstanding about that cumulative understanding as opposed to covering a unit and saying, well, this program has all that built in. But what's really missing are the strategies, the actual ideas for, well, how do we make it stick? It's not just about, well, it's covered. How do you make it stick? And that means knowing your students as well and knowing how to pivot when something is not working, which goes back to pedagogy.
And I'll give you a quick example on that, Faith. So when I first started teaching, if we wanted students to remember things, my thinking was, which I think a lot of teachers think, is the more memorable I can make this, the more they're going to learn it. In other words, if the experience is fun, engaging, then they will really remember it. And so a lot of the lessons were these kind of, Cirque du Soleil, all singing, all dancing kind of affairs. But learning's kind of boring. It's not unlike any other human trait. Now, of course, teachers need to be passionate, and this is where I think it aligns with explicit instruction. That teachers who can model passion for a subject, and you can't do that if you're letting kids discover it for themselves. But I always tell this story about a teacher I had who came into our classroom. We were 16. He had a copy of the Odyssey, and he said, "Boys, this book is going to change your life." And we were just blown away by this guy. He wasn't even a good teacher. He didn't even, he didn't care about what we did. But he talked about this book like his life depended on it. And it was, for me, it was the first time I'd ever seen an adult care about the things I cared about, which was literature and books. And he just spoke, and his whole thing was, this goes beyond examinations, boys. You need to read this poetry because you will get your hearts broken. And this is where you're going to find those answers about love and loss and really important stuff. And to me, it was, my God, this is powerful. But he had to model it. He was showing it. He was being explicit. He wasn't saying, get into groups and say what you think about it or whatever. He was going, this is what this means. And then he would ask us what we think. And it was this really powerful thing. But in order to, if we want students to remember things long term, then we should ask them to retrieve it from their long-term memory. That's just a fact of how learning happens. It's just not a mystery. And you want students, in a very kind of broad sense, you want them to kind of retrieve that thing 3 different times in a number of different ways, either through reading it, through discussing it, through hearing it. This is why those kids from those privileged families, they're not any more intelligent than anyone else. They're just sat around a dinner table with lawyers and doctors, and they're hearing much more words. They're encountering, they're hearing it. They're not cleverer than anybody else. And so, yes, there are differences in aptitudes, but in a general sense, the more you're surrounded by something, the more you have to retrieve it from your knowledge, the more you encounter it, the more durable the learning is. And that's just, I think, one aspect where if teachers are aware of that, then they can make better decisions in their classroom and say, well, I want these students to remember this thing, so I'll build in a quiz in 2 weeks' time, in 3 weeks' time. I will get, instead of asking them if they understand it, I'll get them to show me. I'll get them to, no, don't tell me if you understand it, show me you understand it. Write it down on a mini whiteboard, turn and talk to your partner, whatever that is. And all of those things, those strategies, they become automated. And so they're really skillful, incredibly gifted teachers. And this is where I really think that, this idea that teachers are born and not made. No, we can really help teachers to become better. As Dylan Williams says, not because they're not good enough, but because they can be even better. And that's why I'm driven by this idea of, I wish someone had told me these things in my first 5-10 years of teaching, that I might have made better decisions, that I might have led to better outcomes.
Yeah, we all wish we could turn the clock back, for sure. Judy, any last questions or thoughts before we go into our wrap up?
You mean the traditional BS and cheers part? Okay, so just a thought, a skill a day does not keep the doctor away. And then also gamifying is another great way that I've used in the classroom to make that learning more engaging and to see if it sticks. So I want people to think about, you could even push yourself. It doesn't have to just be turn and talks and yes, dry erase boards, but also gamifying education. Like Faith and I do at professional developments when we facilitate at workshops in schools, we gamify it. We want to see, is there that retrieval and so forth. And you could play the game a couple of weeks later. See, okay, did the learning stick? Okay, learning styles. Every guest that we have on seems to still have some misconceptions and Faith.
Not every guest, some.
You're right, Faith. You're right. But it does come up often.
Yes.
And it comes up when we're talking to people. And I was one that used to believe, oh, I'm an auditory learner, visual learner. And we know that the research does not support that. Any reminders for our guests? And then I want your big thoughts. What do you want people walking away with? And then 2 practical moves. And then Faith is going to get into her shtick.
So I would quickly say learning styles, the idea that teachers should match their instruction to the perceived learning styles of the students is nonsense. It's a ridiculous idea. And even, if you're teaching geography, if you're teaching about the United States, you use a map. You don't use an audio book of the map for the auditory students. You don't, it's absolutely ridiculous. So there's a lot of evidence out there. There's a lot of videos. There's just no evidence to support its use, so don't do it. The second question was, I think, 2 strategies, 2 things to, was that?
Maybe 2 practical moves as we launch the school year that we can incorporate based on what you're telling us today.
Okay, I'm going to focus on one aspect. I'm going to focus on checking for understanding. If you get good at one thing as a teacher, get good at this. To me, it's really the superpower in a classroom, because it covers so many areas. One, it's a great kind of behavioral management tool. It allows you to really get a hold on a classroom in a very positive way. Kids love it. It allows you to really get good at that. And to the 2 strategies I think I would choose would be, 1, mini whiteboards. Get mini whiteboards in your classroom. They're relatively cheap. The kids love it. And the second one is one thing that I see a lot where even where teachers are using checking for understanding well, thinking time. We don't use enough thinking time. Ask a question and make it a habit of saying to the kids, you're going to think about this thing for 30 seconds. And I'm going to ask one person at random and do it in a way that's caring, that's warm. You're not, lining people up against a wall. You're saying, this is fun, this is interesting. Now, what I want you to do is, here's a question. You got 30 seconds to think about it. And you want to make them think about it. And that's where the rocks are grinding, the learning's happening. Then you can do maybe your turn and talk, or you could call or whatever you want to do. So I think those two strategies are two really powerful levers in the classroom for checking for understanding. And then the third thing was?
Biggest thought of the day. Biggest thought of the day.
Biggest thought of the day is, I would say, the science of learning is a powerful lever of equity and of inclusion, and particularly for our most vulnerable learners, they need it just as much as anybody else. And it's a lesson that I'm really passionate about, obviously, with my daughter. Thought of the day: we're more similar than different in how we learn.
That was awesome. So to wrap up, Carl, I want you to give me 3 pieces, 3 points of hogwash. I'm going to use your word, hogwash.
BS. We're the literacy.
BS.
I want you calling BS on 3 things that you want teachers to just stop, or leaders to just stop, that you feel would make a huge difference. Call it out, Carl. I'll press the button when you're done.
One of them is learning styles. So we covered that. I would say the first one is learning styles. The second one, I would say, is the second one is the idea that you learn things best when you discover it for yourself. Okay, that's just not true. That's just not a feature. Then I would say the third one would be something like, a very common one is Bloom's taxonomy, where you got the triangle, where you got the knowledge and facts at the bottom, and then at the top you've got Benjamin Bloom, who did some fantastic work. I'm a big fan of his, but he never came up with that triangle. It was nothing to do with him. That was some executive reading his work and going, oh, let's make this triangle. Knowledge is not at the bottom, and being critical thinking at the top. They're just as much interlinked. You need facts and knowledge to think with things, to be a critical thinker. So if you see a triangle, Bloom's taxonomy, definitely be suspicious of that.
Well, Carl, Hendrick, that was one of the best conversations we've had on the Literacy View. I think everything you said, people should be writing down, honestly. There was so much there. Checking for understanding, explicit instruction, don't bring politics into education. We could go on and on, but
I think we're going to have to do a takeaway Tuesday on this one, Faith. What do you think?
I think maybe even bring a couple of people with us to discuss
I
this.
think so. Faith, you didn't do your traditional cheers. We can't end with the
I
BS.
was cheering through the whole thing, Judy.
Let him say what he's cheering to remind our viewers.
All right. Anything that you're excited about in education that you think people should really be upbeat about right now? So
for all my career, I've been, I started off thinking technology was good. And then for most of my career, I thought it was a really bad thing. Particularly when we see, with phones and that, and I despair that as a culture, we're losing the ability to read. So I think AI is different. And I think AI is one of those things where I can see a world where the drudgery of marking is taken out of the hands of teachers. In other words, all those things we were talking about of instruction and that interplay with the students and the planning. And Daisy Christodoulou is doing some fantastic work on this with her company, No More Marking. It's called, it's a form of, and again, it's quite sophisticated, but I could see a world, and it's crazy to think of, where marking is done by AI. We get a report on, instead of spending 2-3 hours marking books and not getting a lot out of it, you can adapt and be responsive more to the needs of the students. I think if we could shave off a lot of the drudgery for teachers, the report writing, the data entry, the marking, all of that stuff, if AI could, maybe if we could say to teachers, look, we're going to shave off 30 to 40% of the job, and we're going to give you back that interaction with the kids, that working with the kids, that, I think we would maybe be able to retain a lot more teachers in our profession. And we may even be able to attract more to the profession, because at the moment we are hemorrhaging teachers. We can't keep teachers in the profession. We can't hire teachers. So I think that's a possibility. Obviously, I think it's terrifying in one sense that, students writing essays now is gone on their computers. We need to go back to pen and paper. I'm sorry, but that's just, that's just the bottom line. Or there needs to be, an interview with a student. That's just how it's going to have to go. I'm sorry about that. But I think, all the stuff that I really just didn't enjoy as a teacher. So that, like I say, the data entry, spreadsheets, report writing, all of that stuff, if that was taken off the plate and you were saying to teachers, look, just focus on what you're teaching and the students, I think that may be, and maybe it won't work that way, but I think that is something that's potentially exciting.
Yeah, AI, we've discussed this on the Literacy View, and we're big fans of it if used correctly. So thank you, Dr. Carl Hendrick. This was such a pleasure. I've been wanting to have you on for so long. I'm so happy we had this chance to talk. For those of you out there listening, Judy and I are doing some consulting work. We hope you get in touch with us. And it doesn't take that long. We would appreciate if you could take the time to give us a 5-star review. All right, we're wrapping up, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.